Okay. Thank you, Joe. Well, we're going to finish up, hopefully, with the second half of this article from Marx Goldman Sachs, The Fictions of Fictitious Capital by Michael Hudson, a combined article, an interesting one that actually is very complete. And what we'll look at today is the kind of history of some of these issues of what would what we might think of as a fictitious capital. And it helps explain as we go down and find the darn place. Here it is. Um, why I keep yammering on about Italian banks and the like, or banking industries in general. I think the way a good business course would be to teach the entire history of banking rather than simply focus on contemporary money and banking processes. Not that we don't need to know anything about the Fed's open market process, but or the addition or subtraction of gold, but we do probably need to understand a real sense of it. Okay, the financial and industrial antipathy to post-feudal rent seekers. The financial sector's alliance with manufacturing rather than real estate in David Ricardo's day is rooted in medieval European banking as it emerged at the time of the Crusades. Christian sanctions against usury were broken down by a combination of the prestige of the major creditors, that is, church orders, followed by bankers tied to the papacy, those Italians, and that of their leading borrowers, kings, to pay Peter's pence and other tribute to Rome, and increasingly to wage war. Now, let me break for a moment here and say, and of course, local financing of church building, how I even got into all of this was, the whole selling of indulgences in the Middle Ages, that is, saving yourself a spot in heaven. As creditors, the Templars and Hospitallers pioneered the transfer of funds across Europe. Next to royal borrowing, the major market for credit was foreign trade, which flowered with the revival of economic activity fueled largely by the gold and silver looted from Byzantium in 1204. This business prompted the churchmen to define a fair price for bankers to charge for the international transfer of funds. Now, this is what I've talked about, I've been yammering about now for years, is agio. That is, these are the extra charges that you would add, the fees that you would add for, transformation of currency. This became the major loophole in which money lending could occur, most notoriously in a fictitious international arrangement via the quote-unquote dry exchange. These financial practices, that is, war lending to kings for spending abroad, and money changing as commercial activity revived, made banking cosmopolitan in outlook. And you see this referred to. This goes back to my yammering on about Robin Hood, etc. The Napoleonic Wars of 1798 to 1815, there are multiple wars, and Napoleon gets captured, sent off, blah blah blah, comes back, and etc., goes to Russia, and all those other sort of things. These wars impeded trade and hence its import and export financing. France's naval blockade had the effect of a protective tariff wall. Britain's landlords increased crop production, albeit at a rising cost. Conversely, other countries built up their own manufacturing. Resumption of foreign trade after the Treaty of Ghent restored peace in 1815 caused economic crises for these newly vested interests. Imports threatened to undercut the prices that British landlords received, reducing their land rents and prompting them to press for agricultural tariffs, that is, the corn laws. These are, protective tariffs for local corn production. Meanwhile, British manufacturers undersold foreign production, prompting, this is what we were talking about before when we were reading Brad DeLong's book about the 300 miles from Dover. British manufacturers undersold foreign production, prompting American and French industrialists to press for tariff protection. Britain, the United States, France, and Germany thus experienced a fight between free traders and protectionists. Having grown wealthy during Britain's rise as a manufacturing power, its bankers looked forward to a resumption of trade financing, with Britain serving as workshop of the world and banker to it. David Ricardo, the leading advocate for Britain's bankers, lobbied for free trade and an international specialization of production, not national self-reliance. It's kind of the current problem that we have. The resulting tariff fight culminated in 1846 with repeal of the Corn Laws. Unless Britain imported low-priced crops, Ricardo argued, rising domestic food prices as a result of diminishing returns on Britain's limited soil area would prevent British industry from exporting competitively, and hence would not be able to expand trade financing from British banks. This is that moment when imperialism is building or colonialism is building. It's really very necessary to have more flow in that sense. Debt appeared nowhere in Ricardo's labor theory of value. It was silent when it came to the original analysis of cost value. The medieval churchman's concept of just price with regard to agio charges. Adam Smith, Malachi Postlethwaite, and other writers had focused on the extent to which the taxes levied to pay interest on the national debt increased the cost of living. James Stewart had pointed to the exchange rate problems caused by sending money abroad for debt service, mainly to the Dutch. This is the post East India Company sort of stuff, or military spending and subsidies. Ricardo would have none of this. He insisted before Parliament that bank aid could never could cause an economic problem. Capital transfers from military spending, debt service, and international investment would be automatically self-financing. This was the genesis of today's free market deregulatory theory. And there's literature on this. It is, delusional in many ways. Ignoring the debt dimension, Ricardo became the doctrinal ancestor of Milton Friedman's Chicago School of Monetarists. The difference is that, whereas they insist there is no such thing as a free lunch, that's the expression, no such thing as a free lunch, he defined economic rent as unearned income. Ricardian socialists extended the concept of economic rent to a full-fledged attack on landlordism. The Ricardian journalist James Mill advocated Britain's original Domesday Book principle that ground rent should be the tax base. And this is the fundamental when you get back to, Georgism in some sense. It's a kind of reflection on that. His son, John Stuart Mill, became a leading advocate of nationalizing the economic rent that landlords made in their sleep and the unearned increment of rising land prices. The drive to break the power of landed aristocracies in Britain, France, and other countries became the major political fight from the century spanning 1815 and World War I. It was basically a class struggle between capital and landowners. The demand that rent should be handed over to the state to serve in place of taxes, Marx explained, is a frank expression of the hatred the industrial capitalist bears towards the landed proprietor, who seems to him a useless thing, an excrescence upon the general body of bourgeois production. That's such a good phrase. By taxing the land's rental income and that of subsoil minerals provided freely by nature, industry could free itself from the sales and excise taxes that raise the cost of living and doing business. As you read that when libertarians critique your Marxism. Since the 13th century, the labor theory of value had been refined as a tool to isolate the elements of empty pricing that had no counterpart cost of production. Rent and interest were vestiges of medieval privilege from which industrial capitalism sought to purify itself. Its idea of free markets was to liberate society from the overhead of ground rent, monopoly rent, and interest, bringing land and finance into the public domain, socializing them by transforming banking and finance capital to serve the needs of industrial capitalism. Marx expected industrial capitalism to pave the way for socialism by freeing Europe and, in time, the colonies and the continents of Asia, Africa, and Latin America from the carryover of land rent imposed originally by military force and from financial usury capital. The tacit assumption was that industrial financial systems would play as progressive a role in these regions as they were expected to do in the core. There would be no periphery. The Communist Manifesto credited the bourgeois economics of land taxers and kindred reformers in France and Britain with seeking to move society beyond the feudal mode of production. So there's certain modernism at work there. However, it criticized, that is, the Communist Manifesto criticized Europe's revolutions of 1848 for stopping short of helping labor the fight to tax the land's rent, as the physiocrats had sought to do with their single tax. Remember, single tax, l'impôt unique. And as Mill, Cherbulier, Hilditch, Proudhon, and other reformers advocated, it was basically a fight by industry and its financial backers to minimize the cost of feeding labor, not to raise wages and living standards or improve working conditions. Most reformers left private property in place, limiting their aims to freeing markets from the rake-off of economic rent by landlords and monopoly privileges, and only secondarily from the interest charged by bankers and usurers. So it's not a full transformation in that sense. Marxists accordingly criticized utopian socialists and anti-socialist individualists such as Henry George for dealing only with the land issue or naive monetary reforms without addressing labor's fight to improve its working conditions and ultimately to free itself from private property and the means of production. Arguing against followers of George, Louis Untermann noted that in Germany, Ferdinand Lassalle found in Ricardian economics an implicitly socialist program, but never indulged in any illusions as to the efficacy of the single tax idea for the emancipation of the working class. This required a government that would play an active role promoting labor's interests vis-a-vis industrial capital, not only through regulatory reforms, but by outright state ownership of the means of production under working class control. This is that moment where, you could really do have socialism, but not everyone wanted to believe it. The argument over how productive an industrial role high financial would play. The 1815 to 1914 century was relatively free of war. Now, that's, America's Civil War was the most devastating, clearly. But instead of borrowing from bankers, the North issued its own greenback currency. This success prompted bankers throughout the world to redouble their propaganda for quote-unquote hard money, as if bank credit were inherently sounder than public money creation. Subsequent development certainly does not support this claim. Without getting into a big thing on it, but greenbacks, and it's a whole currency issue that arises in from the Civil War that engages the Confederate money counter, whatever. Anyway, that's for another story. The Franco-Prussian War settled France with a reparations debt. This is the 1870s, right? With a reparations debt that it was able to finance without causing any great disturbance. Economists attributed the decline of interest rates over time to the world becoming more secure. Public spending was increasingly for infrastructure to support industrial progress. There was heavy arms spending, to be sure, especially on navies, this is that German thing, but it aimed largely to build up industry in a three-way alliance between industry, government, and high finance. These are iron chips, the use of steel, etc. Governments and the large banks were emerging as national planners via their allocation of credit and public spending. The most productive industrial financing practice emerging on the European continent, especially in Germany, where banking developed the closest linkages with the government and heavy industry. The relative absence of large fortunes made a virtue of necessity. Germany's lag in industrial development obliged its banks and government agencies to take a long-term view based on building up strength over time. Rather than following British and Dutch banks by making straight interest-bearing loans against collateral already in place, the Reichsbank and other large banks engaged in a broad range of activities, that is so-called mixed banking, including equity cross-holdings with their major customers. After World War II, Japan's cash-starved economy and widespread destruction likewise led its banks to establish close debt equity relationships with their customers in order to provide sufficient liquidity to build for the future. This is also in terms of how they organize their corporate structure. Germany's rapid victories over France and Belgium after war broke out in 1914 were widely viewed as reflecting the superior efficiency of its banking system. To some observers, the Great War appeared as a struggle between rival forms of financial organization to decide not only who would rule Europe, but also whether the continent itself would have laissez-faire or a more state socialist economy. In 1915, shortly after fighting broke out, the German Christian socialist priest politician Friedrich Naumann summarized the continental banking philosophy in Mitteleuropa. In England, Herbert Foxwell drew on Naumann's arguments in two essays published in the Economic Journal in September and December 1917, quoting with approval Naumann's contention that the old individualistic capitalism of what he calls the English type is giving way to the new, more impersonal group form, to the disciplined, scientific capitalism he claims as German. Now, of course, we know at the end of the war, this is problematic. In the emerging tripartite integration of industry, banking, and government, finance was undoubtedly the main cause of the success of modern German enterprise. What is striking is how unlikely the prospect of corrosive and unproductive debt appeared a century ago. To be sure, Turkey and Egypt were ruined by foreign debt, and massive fraud and insider dealing occurred in ambitious projects such as the Panama and Suez canals. But the logic of far-reaching financial reform was formulated with evangelical fervor, most notably in France. Count Claude-Henri de Saint-Simon du Système Industriel of 1821 inspired an ideology based on the perception that successful industrialization would require a shift away from interest-bearing debt to equity funding. Banks would be organized much like mutual funds. Glorifying bankers as the future organizers of industry, the Saint-Simonians saw the Industrial Revolution as introducing the capitalist travailleur, a financial engineer, judging where credit could be best applied. Prominent Saint-Simonians included the social theorist Auguste Comte, the economist Michel Chevalier, the socialist Pierre Leroux, and the engineer Ferdinand Lesseps, whose plans for canals elaborated ideas initiated by Saint-Simon. So you can see how all this kind of comes together, particularly in large-scale infrastructure projects like canals. Outside of France, their influence extended to Marx, John Stuart Mill, and Christian socialists in many countries. Marx spoke only with the admiration of the genius encyclopedic brain of Saint-Simon, noted Engels. In 1852, Emile Pereire and his older brother Isaac formed the Société Générale de Crédit Mobilier as a joint stock bank. Their aim was to provide low-cost, long-term equity financing for industrialists to expand production. Now, you see this is a combination of the institution that is a bank with certain other kinds of institutional finance forms. Expand production, replacing the Rothschilds and other banking families who had monopolized French finance. However, as government insiders got into the game, they corrupted the institution. The Austrian credit, Anstalt für Handel and Verb, became a more successful application of credit mobilier principles. Banking in the English-speaking countries remained more in the character of what Marx described as usury capital. British and Dutch practice had long used debt leverage to establish royal monopolies. For example, as when the Bank of England's monopoly of money issue was obtained in exchange for payment in government bonds. U.S. bankers do much the same to today's debtor countries, threatening them with financial crisis if they do not relinquish financial control of the public domain to global banks. This is the reasons why we have an IMF and a World Bank in many ways. Based on capitalizing existing income streams as collateral, Anglo-Dutch banking seemed obliged either to modernize along more industrial lines or make its economies financially obsolete. Foxwell warned that British steel, automotives, capital equipment, and other heavy industries were in danger of becoming obsolescent, largely because the nation's bankers failed to understand the need to extend long-term credit and promote equity investment to expand industrial production. Now, the problem had its roots in the conditions in which British banking took shape. At the time Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, 1776, neither his Scottish contemporary James Watt nor other inventors were able to obtain bank loans to introduce their discoveries. This problem, doing steam engines. They had to rely on their own families and friends, as industrial credit had not yet developed in the late 18th century. Banks issued bills of exchange to finance the shipments of goods once these were produced, but not their manufacture. Procedures were in place to discount bills for immediate payment and to evaluate the borrowing capacity of enterprises whose assets could be quickly liquidated or well-attested income streams that could be capitalized to carry bank loans. As in the case with real property, the preferred collateral was real estate, along with railroads and public utilities with a stable income stream. The Duke of Bridgewater ran up immense personal debts to finance his canals by 1762, to be sure, but these were secured by mortgages against his own property. But early innovations, such as the automobile, had to wait over half a century to obtain financing. The investment banking houses had little to do with the financing of corporations or with industrial undertakings. The great investment houses bitterly opposed the numerous corporate issues which were floated in 1824 and 1825, summarizes one financial historian. The investment houses for a long time refused to take part even in the financing of the British railways. And you can see that reflected in the failures or the floating of corrupt stock issues, et cetera. This is referred to in part of certain Victorian kind of misadventures, let's say, in the finance or like that. British bankers were prone to insist that companies they controlled pay out most of their earnings as dividends and remain highly liquid rather than providing enough financial leeway for them to pursue any kind of long-term investment strategy. By contrast, the major German banks paid out dividends at only half the rate of British banks, retaining their earnings as a capital reserve invested largely in the stock of their industrial clients. Treating their borrowers as allies rather than merely trying to make a profit as quickly as possible, they expected their customers to invest their profits in expanding production rather than paying them out as dividends. And you see that's always that conflict or tension. Britain's bond and stockbrokers were no more up to the task of financing industrial innovation than were its banks. The fact that manufacturing companies could obtain significant funding only after they had grown fairly large prompted broad criticism of Britain's joint stock banks by the 1920s for their failure to finance industry and their favoritism for its international rather than domestic clients. Such much as American activist shareholders do today, after earning their commissions on an issue, they moved on to the next project without much concern for what happened to the investors who had bought the earlier securities. As soon as he has contrived to get his issue quoted at a premium and his underwriters have unloaded at a profit, complained Foxwell in 1917, his enterprise ceases. To him, as the Times says, a successful flotation is of more importance than a sound venture. It's kind of where we are now. Defeat of Germany and the Central Powers in 1917 paved the way for Anglo-Dutch banking principles to become ascendant. Wall Street, from the outset, had followed the practice of hit-and-run stock manipulations and short-term financial extractions of the sort that Marx and other progressive-era writers believed was becoming a thing of the past. U.S. railroad barons and financial manipulators were notorious for issuing watered stock to themselves, overfunding companies with bond borrowings beyond their needs or capacity to carry. The directors of these corporations pocketed the difference, a practice that has led much American industry to stay clear of banking and Wall Street out of self-protection. Neither economists nor futurists anticipated that economic practices might regress. The working assumption is that a positive evolution would occur to more productive forms. But the banking practices of finance capitalism have regressed towards short-term predatory lending. Reversing an 8th-century trend, financial laws have become more predator-oriented. The tax system also has become regressive, reversing the progressive era's financial fiscal program by untaxing property and wealth, shifting the fiscal burden onto labor and industry. The next section is the symbiosis of finance capital with real estate and monopolies rather than industry. Marx expected industrial capital to use its rising power over governments to nationalize land and use its rent as the basic fiscal revenue. But it has been the banks that have obtained the lion's share of land rent, capitalizing it into interest-bearing loans to new buyers. Landed aristocracies no longer dominate the political system. Yet fiscal favoritism for real estate has never been stronger, precisely because property ownership has been democratized on credit. Real estate accounts for some 70% of bank lending in Britain and the United States, making it by far the major market for bank loans, not industry and commerce as anticipated a century ago. This explains why the financial sector now stands behind real estate interests as their major lobbyist for property tax cuts. Mortgage interest now absorbs most of the land's free rental value, which is capitalized into debt overhead rather than serving as the tax base. This is that fundamental thing that has not yet been fully worked out. Voters have come to realize that their interest lies in lowering property taxes, not raising them. Homes are the major asset for most households, and real estate remains the economy's largest asset. Land is still its largest component, and some 80% of capital gains in the U.S. economy are land price gains. Site values are increased by public investment in streets, water and sewer facilities, transportation hubs, school systems, zoning restrictions, the general level of prosperity, and most of all, by whatever bankers will lend. There are 6 variables at work. Hudson identifies these 6 variables. Number 1, lower interest rates for capitalizing land rent into mortgage loans. Number 2, lower down payments. Number 3, slower rates of amortization, that is, giving borrowers longer to pay off the mortgage. Number 4, easier credit terms, that is, looser standards for so-called liar's loans and kindred. The more credit can be extended to bid up real estate prices. Meanwhile, banks recycle their interest income into new loans and also into campaign contributions to politicians, who pledge to leave fealty to that, who pledged to lower property taxes, leaving more rental income to be paid to banks as interest to carry yet larger mortgage loans. Debt leveraging inflates property prices, creating, number 6, hopes for capital gains, prompting buyers to take on even more debt in the speculative hope that rising asset prices will more than cover the added interest, which is paid out of capital gains, not out of current income. So this is, counting problems. Recent years are the first time in history that homeowners and indeed entire economies have imagined that the way to get rich was to run deeper into debt, not to pay it down. Home ownership is a defining criterion for belonging to the middle class. Some 2/3 of the British and U.S. populations now own their own homes, and upward of 90% in Scandinavia. This diffusion of property ownership has enabled the property and financial interests to mobilize popular opposition to taxes on commercial and rental real estate as well as homes. California's Proposition 13 is the most notorious case in such demagogy. And yes, it is, and it has not left. It's there kind of forever. Those who vote know that referenda still refer to these issues. Government moves to check rentier interests. Government moves to check rentier interests are depicted as the road to serfdom. That's kind of, sop to Hayek. Yet untaxing property and finance obliges governments to make up for these tax cuts by raising taxes that fall on consumers and non-FIRE sector business. So, you can see these things shifting around, and then you have other absurdities like the things that are being blurted out of Trump's mouth. This shrinks the economy, lowering its ability to pay the rent needed to pay the bankers on their mortgage loans. So we're brought right back to the problem of debt deflation and the capitalization of interest charges into higher prices. An income profile for the average U.S. wage earner shows the degree to which the cost of living now reflects fire sector costs more than prices for commodities produced by labor. And lest you think that's unimportant, it is a shift in some of these elements. Some 40% of blue-collar wage income in the United States typically is spent on housing. Recent attempts by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to reduce the proportion absorbed by mortgages to 32% have encountered strong bank opposition. Another 15% or so is earmarked to pay other debts. Student loans to get the education required for middle-class employment, auto loans to drive to work from the urban sprawl promoted by tax shifts favoring real estate developers, credit card debt, personal loans, and retail credit. FICA, F-I-C-A, paycheck withholding ostensibly for Social Security and Medicare, a euphemism for the tax shift off the higher income brackets, absorbs 11% of payroll costs. And income and sales taxes borne by labor add another 10 to 15%. This is what I was talking about in the pay stub. This leaves only a third of wage income available to spend on food and clothing, transportation, healthcare, and other basic needs, the so-called, disposable element. This has transformed the character of global competition, yet it is cognitive dissonance as far as academic theories of international trade and investment are concerned. Economics theorizing remains shaped by Ricardo's successes, diverting attention away from the debt and financial overhead as the main economic problem. That's quite true. We can blame also political science for trying to not attend to that kind of issue when they're thinking about international trade, et cetera, and international relations. This is not how matters were supposed to turn out for progressive era reforms of industrial capitalism. The fight to minimize rentier rake-offs in the form of economic rent from land, commercial monopolies, banking, and kindred rent-seeking toll booth privileges has failed. It has failed largely because of the symbiosis between the financial sector and the rent seekers that have become its major customers as access to bank credit has been democratized. On the broadest social level, the ostensible free market, quote unquote, lobbying effort sponsored by banks to shift the property tax onto labor and industry has become a campaign against government itself. The aim is to shift planning, along with public enterprises and their revenues, out of the hands of public agencies to those of Wall Street in the United States, the City of London, the Paris Bourse, Frankfurt, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and other financial centers. The problem is that the vantage point of financial planners is more short-term than that of government. And being short-term, it is extractive, not productive. Finance capital's raid on industry. Marx defined primitive accumulation as the seizure of land and other communally held assets by raiders and the subsequent extraction of tribute or rent. The seizure of land and other communally held assets by raiders and the subsequent extraction of tribute or rent. Today's financial analog occurs when the banks create credit freely and then supply it to corporate raiders for leveraged buyouts or to buy the public domain being privatized. Just as the motto of real estate investors is rent is for paying interest, that of the corporate raider is profit is for paying interest. Takeover specialists and their investment bankers pore over balance sheets to find undervalued real estate and other assets and to see how much cash flow is being invested in long-term research and development. depreciation, and modernization that can be diverted to pay out as tax-deductible interest. Whatever is paid out as income taxes and dividends likewise can be turned into tax-deductible interest payments. The plan is to capitalize the target's cash flow, the EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxation, and an amortization, blah, 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 into payments to the bankers and bondholders who advance the credit to buy out existing shareholders or government agencies. For industrial firms, such as leveraged buyouts, LBOs, are called taking a company private because its stock ownership is no longer publicly available. Permitting interest to absorb the revenue hitherto paid out as taxes and after-tax dividends to stockholders is diametrically opposite to replacing debt with equity funding, as Saint-Simon and subsequent reformers hope to bring about. That is, there is this sense of equilibrium sort of built in there in the original model, but not so much now. The logical end and the dream of bank marketing departments is for all cash flow, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, the EBITDA, is to be paid out as interest, leaving nothing left over for taxes, capital renewal, and modernization to raise labor productivity and living standards. All land rent, corporate profit, tax revenue, and personal income over and basic spending is to be pledged to banks and bondholders as interest. Under such conditions, fortunes are made most readily, not by industrial capital formation, but by indebting industry, real estate, labor, and government, siphoning off the economic surplus in interest, other financial fees, bonuses, and capital gains. Populations willingly go into debt as it appears that gains can be made most easily by buying real estate and other assets on credit, as long as asset prices rise at a pace higher than the rate of interest. Today's financial investors aim at total returns, defined as earnings plus capital gains, with increasing emphasis on the latter gains in real estate, stocks, and bonds. Industrial companies increasingly are financialized to produce such gains for investors, not to increase tangible capital formation. The bubble or Ponzi phase of the financial cycle aims to create the financial equivalent of a perpetual motion machine, sustaining an exponential debt growth by creating enough new credit to inflate real estate, stock, and bond prices at a rate that, at least for a while, enables debtors to cover the interest falling due. As a recent popular phrase puts it, financial collapse is staved off by the indebted economy trying to borrow its way out of debt. This asset stripping dynamic, which Marx characterized as usury capital, is antithetical to that of industrial capital. Based on the liability side of the balance sheet, financial securities take the form of anti-wealth, that is, legalized claims on the means of production and income earned productively. The underlying dynamic is fictitious because it cannot remain viable for long. It sustains interest payments by stripping assets, leaving the economy with less ability to produce a surplus out of which to pay creditors. And indeed, the financial sector destroys life on a scale similar to military conquest. Birth rates fall, lifespans shorten, and emigration soars as economies polarize. This is the free market alternative to progressive era and socialist reforms. It typifies the IMF austerity plans, the International Monetary Fund's austerity plans that epitomize central planning on behalf of the global financial sector. Yet pro-financial ideologues depict public ownership, regulation, and taxation as the road to serfdom, as if the alternative endorsed by Frederick Hayek, Ayn Rand, and Alan Greenspan were not a road to debt peonage. And the end game of this dynamic is a financial crash, wiping out savings that have been lent out beyond the indebted economy's ability to pay. It is at this point that the financial sector wields its political power to demand public bailouts, see 2008, in a vain attempt to preserve the financial system's ability to keep on expanding at compound interest. Much as environmental polluters seek to shift the cleanup costs onto the public sector, so the financial sector demands cleanup of its debt pollution at taxpayer expense. The fact that this is now being done in the context of ostensibly democratic politics throws a leading assumption of political economy into doubt. If economies tend naturally to act in their self-interest, how did the financial sector gain such extractive power to raid and dismantle industry and shed its tax burden? If Darwinian models of self-betterment are to explain the past century's development, they must show how creditors have translated their financial power into political power in the face of democratic parliamentary and congressional reform. How has planning become centralized in the hands of Wall Street and its global counterparts, not in the hands of government and industry, as imagined almost universally a century ago? And why has social democratic, labor, and academic criticism become so silent in the face of this economic counter-enlightenment? The answer is by deception and covert ideological manipulation via junk economics. Financial lobbyists know what smart parasites know. The strategy is to take over the host's brain to make it believe that the free luncher is part of its own body. The FIRE sector, the FIRE sector, is treated as part of the economy, not as draining the host's nourishment. The host even goes so far as to protect the free rider, as in the 2008-2009 bailouts of Wall Street and British banks at taxpayer expense. When such growth culminates in financial wreckage, banks demand public bailouts. They claim that this is necessary to enable them to resume lending, but they will not lend more against property already so deeply indebted that it remains in negative equity. Hoping to turn the crisis into an opportunity for further financial incursions into the industrial economy, bank lobbyists propose that governments help indebted homeowners and real estate investors avoid default by cutting property taxes yet further, shifting the fiscal burden yet more onto labor and non-financial business. Tax cuts on wealth are promoted as if they will be invested rather than used to pay the financial sector more interest or be gambled on currencies and exchange rates, interest rates, stock and bond prices, credit default swaps, and kindred derivatives. There's the recession in a nutshell. Economic evolution does not necessarily follow the path of greatest efficiency. The oligarchic, creditor-oriented Roman Empire collapsed into the Dark Age, after all. Financially destructive policies may overwhelm technological potential. Bubble-type prosperities based on debt-leveraged asset price gains at the expense of the economy at large. Rising housing prices raise the cost of living, while rising stock and bond prices increase the cost of buying a retirement income, leaving pension funds unable to make good on their promises. Pension fund capitalism and other financial modes of exploiting labor. We're getting close to the end, but I think I'll read to the end, and then we can yak, I suppose. Finance capital's modes of exploiting labor go far beyond that of industrial capital, employing it to sell its products at a profit, and even beyond simple usurious lending to labor, above all for housing. Most innovative has been the appropriation of labor's savings via pension funds and mutual funds. In the 1950s, General Motors and other large companies offered to contribute to funds to pay pensions in exchange for slower growth in wages. This policy, which Peter Drucker patronizingly called pension fund socialism, turned over wage set-asides to professional money managers to buy stock and junk bonds to make financial gains, but not in a manner that necessarily promotes industrial capitalism. Money would grow through the proverbial magic of compound interest, making money purely from money, that is M-M prime. The dream to manage labor's savings on a commission basis, steering it to inflate stock and bond prices. And indeed, pension fund savings did fuel a stock market run-up from the 1960s onward. In the process, they provided corporate raiders and other financial managers with funds to use against labor and against industrial capital itself. Pension fund managers played a large role in the junk bonding of industry in the 1980s. And finding themselves graded on their performance every 3 months, fund managers back raiders who seek to gain by downsizing and outsourcing labor. So you could see that, the flexible production, the post-Fordist production, the movement of outsourcing stuff came at exactly the same moment. So that there's a financialization equivalence to that, to the disintegration of the industrial base. They typically find their fortune and even job survival to lie in using pension savings and not in ways that increase employment, improve working conditions, or invest in productive capital formation, but in making gains purely by financial means. That is corporate looting that strips assets to pay dividends and increase short-term stock prices or to simply pay off creditors. Meanwhile, the largest sellers of stocks have been managers and venture capitalists cashing out by selling into a market fueled mainly by labor's wage set-asides. Pension funds thus turn out to play a key role in enabling finance capitalists to realize their gains, only to be their fate to be left holding an empty bag in the end. Selling off stocks to pay retirees creates an outflow of funds from the stock market that reverses the initial price run-up. Money manager capitalism aims to financialize Social Security and Medicare along similar lines, sending a new tsunami of public funds into the stock market to produce capital gains. A dress rehearsal for this plan was staged in Chile after its 1973 military coup of Allende. The Chicago boys who advised the junta called it labor capitalism, a cynical Orwellian term that Margaret Thatcher adopted for her program of privatizing Britain's public utilities. The labor here represents the exploited party, not the beneficiary. A slice of its wages is withheld and turned over to the employer's financial affiliate, the banco for the Chilean grupos. When a high enough pension reserve is accumulated, the employer transfers it to the banco or kindred affiliate in an offshore banking center, leaving the industrial employer a bankrupt shell. The actuarial fiction is that corporate, state, and local pension funds and Social Security invested financially can grow exponentially by enough to pay for retirement and healthcare. This goal cannot be met in practice because the real economy is unable to grow at a rate required to support the growth in debt service. And this is the whole current issue in the U.S. Social Security system. And of course, you could see that operative in the manipulation of the U.S. Postal Service's pension fund, or the demand to pay the payment of it. It was just bizarre that it was even allowed. Widespread awareness of this fact that has led to the corporate ploy of threatening bankruptcy if unions do not agree to replace defined benefit pensions with defined contribution programs in which all that employees know is how much is docked from their paycheck, not what they will wind up with. General Motors went bankrupt as a result of its inability to fund the pensions guaranteed by their defined benefit plans. Financial claims rise exponentially beyond the economy's ability to pay. Bubble economies try to postpone the inevitable crash by inflating prices for real estate, stocks, and bonds by enough to enable debtors to take out higher loans against the property they pledge as collateral. Governments balance their budgets by privatizing public enterprises, selling toll booth privileges on credit to buyers who bid up their prices by debt leveraging. Financial underwriters reap commissions, and insiders making a killing as sales prices for stocks are underpriced to guarantee first-day price jumps. Mrs. Thatcher perfected this ploy, making unprecedented fortunes for early players and underwriters in the privatization game. A crash occurs at the point where this disparity is widely recognized. To bankers, the antidote is to lend enough new credit to reinflate prices, real estate, and other assets, enabling new buyers to borrow the credit to buy property from defaulters. Rather than scaling back the U.S. economy's over-indebtedness, for example, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, have bailed out the banks to save them from taking a loss on debt write-downs. The dream is to keep the compound interest scheme expanding ad infinitum. But the pretense that fictitious finance capital claims can be paid must be dropped at the point where financial managers desert the sinking financial ship. Their last act before the bubble bursts is the time-honored practice of taking the money and running, paying themselves as large bonuses and salaries as corporate treasuries and public bailouts allow. Note that that has been what's happening. The conclusion, we're almost at the end. Finance capitalism has become a network of exponentially growing interest-bearing claims wrapped around the production economy. The internal contradiction is that its dynamic leads to debt deflation and asset stripping. The economy is turned into a Ponzi scheme by recycling debt service to make new loans to inflate property prices by just enough to justify yet new lending. But a limit is imposed by the shrinking ability of surplus income to cover the debt service falling due. That's what the mathematics of compound interest are about. Borrowing to make speculative gains from asset price inflation does not involve tangible investment in the means of production. It's based simply on M-M prime, not M-C-M prime. The debt overhead grows exponentially as banks and other creditors recycle their receipt of debt service into new and riskier loans, not productive credit. Half a century of IMF austerity programs has demonstrated how destructive this usurious property is by limiting the economy's ability to create a surplus. Yet economies throughout the world now base their pension planning, medical insurance, state and local finances on a faith in compound interest, without seeing the inner contradiction that debt deflation shrinks the domestic market and blocks economies from developing. And it's worse, of course, because the IMF is obviously used as leverage in terms of the global north versus the global south. What is irrational in this policy is the impossibility of achieving compound interest in a real economy whose productivity is being eroded by the expanding financial overhead raking off a rising share. And meanwhile, a fiscal sleight of hand has taken Social Security and Medicare out of the general budget and treated them as user fees rather than entitlements. Note that there's media framing that's built on that. This makes blue-collar wage earners pay much higher tax rate than the FIRE sector, the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate sector, and the upper income brackets. FICA, F-I-C-A, paycheck withholding has become a forced savings in advance, ostensibly to be invested for future entitlement spending, but in practice, it's lent to the Treasury to enable it to cut taxes on the higher brackets. You see, there's a subsidy. The middle class is subsidizing other things. Instead of financing Social Security and Medicare out of progressive taxes levied on the highest income brackets, mainly the FIRE sector, the FIRE sector, the dream of privatizing these entitlement programs is to turn this tax surplus over to financial managers to bid up stock and bond prices, much as pension fund capitalism did from the 1960s onward. A century ago, most economic futurists imagined that labor would earn higher wages and spend them on rising living standards. But for the past generation, labor has used its income simply to carry a higher debt burden. Income over and above basic needs has been capitalized into debt service on bank loans used to finance debt-leveraged housing and to pay for education, originally expected to be paid out of the property tax and other basic needs. Although debtors' prisons are a thing of the past, a financial characteristic of our time is the post-industrial obligation to work a lifetime to pay off such debts. Meanwhile, the FIRE sector now accounts for 40% of U.S. business profit. Just think of that for a second, right? The finance, insurance, and real estate sector now accounts for 40% of U.S. business profit. Despite the tax accounting fiction cited earlier, financial lobbyists have led a regressive about-face towards an economic counter-enlightenment, reversing an 800-year tendency to favor debtors. The bankruptcy laws have been rewritten along creditor-oriented lines by banks, credit card companies, and other financial institutions, and put into the hands of politicians in what best may be called a financialized democracy, or as the ancients called it, oligarchy, shifting the tax burden onto labor while using government revenue and new debt creation to bail out the banking sector has polarized the U.S. economy to the most extreme degree since statistics began to be collected. The progressive era expected planning to pass into the hands of government, not those of a financial sector at odds with industrial capital formation and economic growth. Nearly everyone a century ago expected infrastructure to be developed in the public domain in the form of public utilities whose services would be provided freely or at least subsidized rates in order to lower the price of living and doing business. Instead, public enterprises since about 1980 have been privatized on credit and turned into toll booth privileges to extract economic rent. Bankers capitalize these opportunities, which are sold on credit. Little is left for the tax collector after charging off interest, depreciation, and amortization, managerial salaries, and stock options. The resulting tax squeeze impoverishes economies, obliging governments either to cut back their spending or shift the fiscal burden onto labor and non-financialized industry. The resulting financial dynamic is more of like what Marx described as usury capital than industrial banking. In the spirit of the Saint-Simonians, he believed industrial capitalism to direct credit into productive capital formation. He expected that financial planning would pave the way for a socialist reorganization of society. Instead, it is paving the road to neo-serfdom. Financial operators are using credit as a weapon to strip corporate assets on behalf of bankers and bondholders. Employees can afford homes and other property, and indeed entire corporations, only by borrowing the purchase price on terms that involve a lifetime of debt peonage, and indeed, in most countries, bearing personal liability for negative equity when housing prices plunge below mortgage levels. Government planning has become subordinate to the dictates of unelected central bankers and the International Monetary Fund, imposing austerity programs rather than funding capital formation and rising living standards. Having analyzed finance capital's tendency to grow exponentially, Marx nonetheless believed that it would be subordinated to the dynamics of industrial capital. With an optimistic Darwinian ring, he shared the tendency of his contemporaries to underestimate the ways in which the vested interests would fight back to preserve their privileges, even in the face of democratic political reform. He expected industrial capitalism to mobilize finance capital to fund its expansion, and indeed its evolution into socialism, plowing profits and financial returns into more capital formation. How modern of him. It was a task of socialism to see more of this surplus spent on rising wages and living standards while improving the working conditions, and spent by government to freely provide an expanding range of basic needs, or at the very least at subsidized prices. Infrastructure spending and rising living standards thus would become the ultimate beneficiaries of capital formation, not landowners, monopolists, or predatory finance. This is not how matters have worked out. More of the economic surplus is being siphoned off as land rent and interest. Yet many of Marx's followers conflate his analysis of industrial capital with the financial dynamic of users' capital. The latter is not part of the industrial economy, but grows autonomously by purely mathematical means, see derivatives, running ahead of the economy's ability to produce a surplus large enough to pay the exponentially soaring financial overhead. And in contrast to his analysis of industrial capital, Marx explained why the financial overgrowth, that is, recycling savings into new loans rather than investing them productively in tangible capital, cannot be sustained. So Marx is saying the credit system, which has its focus in the so-called national banks and the big money lenders and usurers surrounding them, constitutes enormous centralization and gives to this class of parasites the fabulous power not only to periodically despoil industrial capitalists, but to interfere in actuality in a most dangerous manner. And this gang knows nothing about production, has nothing to do with it. Society, therefore, faces a choice between, number one, saving the economy by writing down debts to the ability to carry without stripping the economy, and number two, saving the financial sector, trying to preserve the fiction that debts growing at compound interest can be paid. For pensions and other public programs, for example, this means a choice between, number one, paying them on a pay-as-you-go basis out of the real economic surplus, and number two, the fictitious assumption that funds can earn annual returns of 8% or more to provide for labor's retirement by asset price inflation, fueled by debt leveraging, and purely financial maneuvering, M-M prime. If economic evolution is to reflect the inner logic and requirements of society's technological capabilities, then finance capital must be subordinated to serve the economy, not to be permitted to master and stifle it. This is what John Maynard Keynes meant by what he gently called the euthanasia of the rentier. In practice, it means that governments must prevent property rents and other returns to privilege from being capitalized into bank loans. To save society, its victims must see that asset price inflation fueled by debt leveraging makes them poorer, not richer, and that financialization is the destroyer and exploiter of industrial capital as well as labor. The objective of classical political economy was to bring prices in line with socially necessary costs of production. This was to be achieved in large part by taxing away economic rent in order to prevent it from being capitalized into loans to new buyers. Buying rent extracting opportunities on credit increases prices for basic needs, turning society into a toll booth economy. It also forces governments to compensate by raising taxes on labor and tangible capital. Many social democratic and labor parties have jumped on the bandwagon of finance capital, not recognizing the need to rescue industrial capitalism from dependence on neo-feudal finance capital before the older conflict between labor and industrial capital over wage levels and working conditions can be resumed. This is what happens when one reads only volume 1 of Capital, neglecting the discussion of fictitious capital in volumes 2 and 3 and theories of surplus value. So there, we got to the end. Now, are there questions, comments, brickbats? Ooh, bootable USB drives. Ah, what a problem there. Predators and predators, indeed. Okay, so no questions, queries. I know that I beat everyone, bludgeoned everyone into silence, but I urge you to read this because it really does describe the current situation, even though it sits within a historical context. Not much has changed.
No, I just have a quick comment, which is as for your discussion, it is somewhat ironic. I'm part of a union. I have a pension, or I will receive a pension, as a defined benefit. But the reality is that pension is ultimately invested in the stock market.
Indeed.
So, it has a diversity. I know because IATSE, the union I'm part of, is a pretty diverse. I know it's pretty well diversely invested, stocks, bonds, all of that stuff. Like they have a fiduciary responsibility, but still a large portion of it is in the stock market. And, it's by no means, it ain't social security, that's for sure. It's not like just growing there's a certain level of risk and it goes up and it goes down. And we get these reports and, yes, they're solvent, of course, and they'll be able to pay everybody. But I've always thought that was kind of funny.
Well, there's a certain irony about it, but that's how capital operates.
Exactly.
I'm in the same union, IATSE, and I am getting a pension from IATSE, so I definitely appreciate having it. But yeah,
let me just say that those of I'm in a union. I was in a union too, so that we do have their pensions and stuff floating around there, but they, with respect, they could have been made better and often, well, this financialization has sort of operated parasitically. I mean, the example is still good. There's a lot of stuff going on that perhaps it would have been better had more centralized, i.e. government control, had been made over those kinds of things. And needless to say, since 1980, it's gotten even more out of control.
Yep.
And if we lose this fucking election, speaking as a Democrat, I mean, it's just going to get really out of control.
Oh yeah, it's over. Game over.
It's game over. It's truly game over. I mean, I mean, everyone will do what they have to do, but strange things will happen.
I'd kind of like to, declare a distinction between me and, as a fish in the ocean, who might be participating in the problem, but I didn't, create the problem. Like,
No.
yeah, it's like I succumbed to the fiction of the American dream, I guess, and thought buying a house was the right thing to do, but
It wasn't a wrong thing to do. Let's put it that way.
Oh.
And I mean, and it did create wealth, and it did, sustain the building of the family, and et cetera, et cetera. And we shouldn't be guilty about that. It's just that I think we could have done it. It could have been done better had the government, whatever, operated better. And we did trust them, and it's to our regret, but
Yes.
on the other hand, there are those people who voted for socialists in every election, and what good did that do? Whatever.
I would have tried to do something else had I known back then.
Had we all known. And yet, the theory has always been there. It just simply, it's about raising consciousness. I mean, ultimately, to speak from a political point of view, that's the thing.
Well, and it gave me a sense of superiority and a sense of self-satisfaction.
That's right. That now that you have greater value invested in Delaware.
No, I was kidding when I meant when I voted for socialism.
Oh, there you go.
I thought that sense of superiority was a pre-existing condition.
It might be, Joe. I don't know.
Indeed. Those
No,
are going to go away in the next if Trump wins.
Oh, boy.
All righty. Anything else? I will. As usual, I yacked fairly long, but I hope people got something out of it. We'll talk more about fictitious capital. Obviously, the fictitious element is, it's there. It's just that it's just a feature. It's not a bug. It's just part of how the system operates, and we need to break down the fictions to, part the veils, whatever, gain transparency, however you want to call it. But that's kind of what we should do, in our interactions and our own practices. And if we're going to make a choice in our political choices, we unfortunately have only one choice in this current election, unless you want to sacrifice it to Cornel West or what's his name in the Libertarian Party, or Jill Stein. But anyway.
Well, that's what I meant by a sense of superiority.
Oh, all right. Yes.
Sense of
Yes.
self-satisfaction.
Oh, indeed. Although it's not going to make much difference voting in Delaware.
No. No, it's not. Which is says something about our great electoral system.
Indeed, if you go a couple miles over the border, it might make a difference in Pennsylvania.
That's for sure, yeah. Actually, I can walk to Pennsylvania in 3 minutes from my house.
There you go. It's a beautiful area, though, John. I recall having a wonderful dinner somewhere over in Brandywine or something. It's really nice over there.
Yeah, it's nice.
So you can go
Anyway.
to Pennsylvania and drive people to the polls on election day.
There you go.
Right, it's true.
Well, I'm actually planning to do that.
Are you?
Yeah. Get a hotel room. I don't know, somewhere in Pennsylvania. Maybe like the Hershey area, since I know that area from my old days.
That's good.
And I hope you're going to drive Democrats to the polls.
No, only Republicans, but I'm not going to drive them. Actually, I'm going to leave them. I'm going to pick them up and leave them in like weird places. Like,
Oh,
I was going to say
Yeah,
to drive them off a cliff, but never
yeah,
mind.
this is the 7. No, this is the polling. I know it says it's the 7-Eleven, but it's the polling place. Believe me. All right, good luck.
yeah.
You're getting pulled right now.
I know it says Stuckey's on the outside, but there is a polling place inside.
I,
Or yes, the Bob Evans is now a polling place. Yeah, you can. They'll give you free biscuits and gravy after you cast your vote.
that's much better than a sticker.
That's definitely. And the
All
Cracker
righty.
Barrel, that's also a polling place.
They would probably
Oh, thank
believe
you.
that.
Well, I think it's within my power to cut the live stream, so I'm going to do that in a second. Let me thank you for your participation and your attention. And I hope that people will read or at least watch the little video on fictitious capital, because it is a kind of key element of all these things, and it's just one way in which we can talk about, as Hudson here does, about all these little things that are going on. With all these different financial things that most of us probably should know more about. We sort of, we assume somebody else is gonna fix it, and I don't know. I mean, I like my accountant, but I haven't talked to her in ages. Anyway, so let me thank you for your indulgence, and I will cut the live stream. There we go.